Good morning, one and all. I am Mathew PP, Assistant Professor, Department of Mechanical Engineering, Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. Welcome to a lecture on Module 4 of the course ME368 Marketing Management offered to the 6th semester BTech students. Now, in this lecture, we'll be discussing the concept of consumer research, consumer behavior, the stimuli response model for understanding consumer buying behavior, and the factors that influence consumer buying behavior. So without further delay, let's get started. So first of all, let us discuss the importance of the concept called consumer research. Why is it important to understand and study our consumers? Now, the success of any organization involved in the sales and marketing of products and services depends on their ability to understand their consumers, their needs, and their behaviors. So, consumer research plays a vital role in the success of a company. Now, in earlier days, when the markets were small and the companies were small, they used to directly sell their products to the consumers, which meant that they had direct contact with the consumers. Now, this made it possible for them to understand their needs, their behaviors easily. But with the advent of globalization, it became very difficult for the companies to have direct contact with consumers because with the start of globalization, the companies and markets they grew in size. So they had to resort to a specific research operation called consumer research to understand their needs and their behaviors. Consumer research, it tries to study the people who buy, why they make a purchase, how they make a purchase, when they make a purchase, and from where. The most important factor studied as a part of consumer research is the consumer's response to various kinds of stimuli. Now, in this module, we'll be analyzing the consumer's response to two kinds of stimuli. They are marketing stimuli and other stimuli. We would discuss these stimuli and their corresponding consumer responses in the slides to come. So, the importance of consumer research can be understood by identifying or understanding the benefits that consumer research provides to an organization. So consumer research, it helps to identify or understand the psychology of what consumers think and feel about a product, and also help to understand how consumers reason and select between different available alternatives. Now, the alternative can be a choice of a product to satisfy a consumer need, a choice of different brands of a product, or a choice amongst different retailers from which a particular brand can be brought from. Consumer research also helps to understand how the psychology of consumers is influenced by the external environment. They also help you to understand the behavior of consumers while they shop and also help you to identify things that can be done to motivate and influence consumers to make a purchase. So these benefits provided by carrying out consumer research clearly shows the importance of consumer research. Now let us move on to the stimuli response model for buyer behavior. Now this model helps you to understand the buyer behavior by recording and analyzing the response of buyers to various kinds of stimuli. The stimuli that can be given to a consumer can be either marketing stimuli or other stimuli. The consumers take in this particular stimuli and they respond differently because they have different ways of processing the stimuli. So in a buyer response model for buyer behavior, there are three major elements. They are the stimuli, the buyer's black box, the area where the stimuli is being processed, and a buyer response, which is an outcome to stimuli being processed by the buyer's black box. So the stimuli that can be provided can be either marketing stimuli or other stimuli. Marketing stimuli include the 4 P's of marketing mix, which are product, price, place, promotion, etc. So these variables can be changed, and a change in these marketing variables, which are controllable by the organization, will lead to a particular kind of response from the consumer. And by noting how a consumer responds to a change in any of these marketing variables would help us to understand how a particular consumer or what his behavior is like. The other stimuli that can be changed, which are not controllable by the company, include economic stimuli, political stimuli, social stimuli, and technological stimuli. Any change in the economic, political, social, and technological situations will also result in a change in the buyer response. So the stimuli response model of buyer behavior, it tries to understand the buyer behavior by recording a change in the buyer response when there is a change in stimuli. Now the response of an individual buyer or a consumer, it is varied from consumer to consumer. That is because each consumer processes the stimuli in a different fashion. So the stimuli is being taken up by an individual consumer. He processes the stimuli and makes a corresponding response. The way in which he processes the stimuli, it depends upon the buyer's personal characteristics and also his buying decision-making process. Now, these buyer characteristics and buyer decision-making process can be different for different people. So now we'll move on to the concept of consumer behavior. We will first of all understand what consumer behavior is and then list out the possible factors that will influence consumer behavior. Consumer behavior study or consumer behavior analysis involves the study of processes used by consumers to select, secure, use, and dispose of products, services, experiences, or ideas that they use to satisfy their needs. Now, the consumer can be either an individual, a group, or an organization. So, the processes used by these individuals, groups, or organizations to select among multiple alternatives, to secure the selected alternative, and the fashion or the way in which they use and dispose of these products, services, experience, or ideas, and the impacts that these choice of processes that they use on the consumer and the society. Now, the study of the impact of processes used by consumers to select a product or service to satisfy their need is also an important aspect of consumer behavior study. An example for this would be the choice from amongst food products. Take the case of two food products, one being organic and healthy, the other being synthetic and less healthy. The first choice, organic, is healthy. At the same time, it is much more costlier than the second alternatives, which are generally cheaper. Now, if the consumer selects his product prioritizing the price or giving consideration only to the price, then his choice would obviously be the synthetic food product, which is available at a cheaper rate. Now, this particular selection process will have negative impacts on his health in the long run. So the impacts of the processes used by consumers on the consumer itself and on the society is also an important aspect to be studied. So this is also covered under consumer behavior study. So there are a wide variety of factors which influence consumer behavior, and these factors can be broadly classified into two. They can either be internal factors or external factors. Now, internal factors are those factors which are subjective in nature. They depend upon the person, or it varies from person to person. And the second set of factors are external or environmental factors. Now, major factors influencing consumer behavior are divided into four types. They can be either cultural, social, personal, and psychological. So, before going into the discussions of the factors influencing consumer behavior, let us briefly discuss the roles of a consumer or the roles of individuals during a consumer buying process. So, consumers, they play various roles during a purchase process. The various roles can be one among five. The consumer can play a role of an initiator, he can play a role of an influencer, he can play a role of a decider, a role of a buyer, or a user during a purchase process. So, initiator is a person who thinks about buying a product. He is a person who initiates a buying activity. The influencer is a person whose views or advices influences the buying process. A decider is a person who ultimately makes the buying decision. The buyer is a person who actually makes the purchase. and the user is a person who uses the product after purchase. So the consumers during a purchase process can play one or more roles among the listed five. To take an example, let us take into the case of purchase of a car in a family. The person who actually thinks about the idea of buying a new car. For example, let us take the case of the son, the eldest son in the family being an initiator, where he suggests that the family buys a new car. Now he plays the role of an initiator. Now there are a lot of people whose views and advices finally influences the buying process. So in the same example, while considering different alternatives, views and advices from various people from among the family, like the mother, the father, the siblings in the family, and also from people external to the family, like friends, colleagues, and even the salesperson, they influence the consumer's buying decision. So such a person who has a certain level of influence on the buying process, they play the role of an influencer. The person who actually decides what is to be bought from among the different alternatives is the person we call the decider. So in the above example which we have discussed, it might be the father in the family that decides which car needs to be bought, and the person who actually makes the purchase is referred to as the buyer. So the purchase, even though the decision might be taken by the father, the purchase might be done by the mother. So here, even though the decider is the father of the family, the purchase being actually made by the mother is playing the role of a buyer. And the person who ends up using the bought product plays the role of the user. So a consumer during a buying process can play any one or more of these five roles. They can be an initiator, an influencer, a decider, the buyer, or the user. Now coming to the factors that influence consumer behavior, there are four sets of factors: cultural factors, personal factors, social factors, and psychological factors influencing consumer behavior. Now we'll start off our discussions with the cultural factors that influence consumer behavior. Now, culture or cultural factors are the broadest, the deepest, and the most important influencing factor. A thorough understanding of consumer behavior requires the understanding of the buyer's culture, subculture, social class, and cultural trends. Now, cultural factors are again subdivided into four sub-factors. They are culture, subculture, social class, and cultural trends. Now, let us take the very first sub-factor called culture. Culture, it refers to beliefs, customs, rituals, and practices that a particular group of people follow. Now, culture, it varies from country to country or from region to region within a particular country. Now, culture is what dictates the buying and the decision making patterns used by a person. As a child grows up in a particular cultural environment, he inculcates the buying and the decision-making patterns which are relevant in the culture that he is brought up in. So, an example for how consumer behavior would be influenced by culture can be given by the case of the use of saris and dhotis. Now, saris and dhotis are clothes which are primarily worn more by people in the south or the southern parts of India rather than people in the north. Now, this use of saris and dhotis are part of the culture and the traditions of the people of the south. So, correspondingly, the sale of saris and dhotis would be more amongst people who have following or who belong to the culture of the South Indian people. Another relevant example would be the case where the taste in food is influenced by culture. Take, for example, the case of the food served by McDonald's. Now, McDonald's serves burgers, different kinds or different takes on the same kind of burger in different parts of the world. For example, their menu in the US and the European countries are a much less spicier variant rather than the menu that is being offered in India, where you have burgers which are much more spicier in their taste. Take the case of the Maharaja Mac. It's a spicier version of the burgers that are served in other parts of the world. So the kind of food that is taken up by people in a particular region is also influenced by the culture. The second sub-factor that is important and influences consumer behavior is a subculture. Now, every culture and every society is made up of subcultures, each subculture being a group of people who share similar values, customs, and beliefs. So, some of the common subcultures are different nationalities within a culture, peoples of different religious faiths in a culture, people with different ethnic backgrounds within a culture, they all form subcultures. Now, subculture is also a very important influencing factor. Take, for example, different religious groups. Different religious groups have their own beliefs, and these beliefs either prevent them from using a certain kind of product or generally entertains the use of certain kinds of products. Similarly, different nationalities among people in a country also results in different subcultures. Their tastes, due to the different differences in origin, are also factors that influence consumer behavior. The third important sub-factor that influences consumer behavior is social class. Now, a class necessarily means a group of people with certain common characteristics. These common characteristics can be purchasing power, their lifestyles, their interests, etc. So, based upon the class to which a person belongs, their needs will be different, and correspondingly, the way they behave will also be different. Generally, there are three classes of people, we divide people into three classes: the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class. The people belonging to each of these classes being united by certain common characteristics such as purchasing power, lifestyle, interests, etc. So people belonging to these three different classes will have three different types of needs, and correspondingly the products that serve the needs of these different classes will also be different. An example for this would be the existence of dollar and thrift stores which sell products which are cheap and low cost versus high-end retailers who sell similar products of higher quality at higher prices. So we have retailers that meet the needs of both the lower class and the upper class. Different retailers satisfying the needs of different classes. Now the last important factor that influences consumer behavior is the cultural trend. So as time progresses, there is a change in the culture and new trends develop in a particular culture. Social pressure and desire to belong to a particular group may influence or pressurize a person to take up certain types of trends which evolve in a particular culture. So by social pressure and desire to belong to a group, one may be influenced by changing trends in society. Now, common example for how cultural trends influence consumer behavior is the recent development of social media sites like Facebook, Instagram. So peer pressure and social pressure makes people use these media platforms even though they do not find any use for it. Purely out of peer pressure, social pressure, or desire to belong to a group of people, they take up these particular trends. So trends in the culture which evolve with time also influences consumer behavior. The next important factor that influences consumer behavior are social factors. Now, there are three sub-factors under social factors. They are reference groups and membership groups, family, and social roles and status. So let us take the very first factor called reference groups and membership groups. So people usually belong to different social groups that they belong to. So these social groups that they belong to influences their buying behavior. These social groups might be groups which are related to age, place of residence, work, leisure, hobbies, etc. For example, a person belonging to a particular area of residence might be a member of that residence association. So that forms a social group or a reference group. Him being part of that resident group, he is influenced by other people who belong to the same residence group. So his behavior is influenced by the other members of the group that he belongs to. So that is how reference groups and membership groups influence consumer behavior. There is another kind of group called an aspirational group. It is a kind of group that a person doesn't belong to but wishes to be part of. An example would be a person who currently doesn't own any kinds of two-wheelers but would like to be a part of biker groups in the future. So such kinds of groups to which one has a slight tendency to be part of or wishes to be part of but isn't actually a member of a particular group. Those kinds of groups are what we refer to as aspiration groups. Now, aspiration groups also influence the consumer's buying behavior. For example, a person who wishes to be part of the Royal Enfield or the Enfield Owners Club, even though he doesn't own an Enfield at the moment, he has a tendency, or his tendency is behavior to products that are related to bike groups are generally positive in nature. Now, the second important factor, social factor that influences consumer behavior is the family. The family is where a person's or an individual's personality, values, attitudes, and opinions are shaped. So, family plays a vital role in determining the consumer behavior. An example for how family influence consumer behavior is the case of a family of tea users. A new member coming into this family of tea users with time may also imbibe the same behavior. Even though he might be currently a person who prefers to have coffee with tea, due to his or her constant interaction with a group of people who are frequent or regular users of tea, he might imbibe the same characteristic. So, such is the influence of family upon consumer behavior. Third important social factor are the social roles and status. Now, a social role refers to actions or duties expected to be performed by a person or an individual in lieu of his or her family position, work, etc. So, people belonging or having similar social roles, they have common consumption trends. For example, a person who is the head of the family, the father of a family, has a social role of a father. So, fathers usually are united by certain common consumption trends. Similarly, people belonging or performing the same kinds of work also fall under, say, the same kind of social roles. So, the role that they play in the society and the relative importance of the role of their role in society, that is what we refer to as a status, that also influences the consumer's behavior. For example, a person who is a CEO of a company usually resorts to buying business sedans or luxury cars and not use regular cars to signify his status. So, social roles and status also determines a consumer's buying behavior. The next important factor influencing consumer behavior are personal factors. Now, these personal factors are characteristics of individuals. They change from one person to another. So, some of the common personal factors that influence consumer behavior are age and life cycle. A person with different ages and belonging to different stages of the human life cycle will have different needs, and these needs will dictate the kind of behavior that they have to a certain kind of product or service. For example, take the case of food habits. Younger people generally favor junk food which are tastier, but as they age and they move into the latter parts of their life cycle, they tend to prefer much healthier foods. Similarly, the stage of a person in family, his role, whether being single, married, or married with kids, also influences consumer behavior. Example is a case where you see a single person, a person who's single, having more resource to spend on his needs, on meeting his needs, whereas a person who's married or married with kids has to divert his earnings or his resources to meet the needs of his entire family. So his priority and behavior towards products will change with age, life cycle, and stage of family life. The second important personal factor is the purchasing power. Now, purchasing power is what decides what a person can afford and cannot. So, purchasing power is the second important personal factor. Now, sometimes purchasing power or it the purchase of products is just purely to show off the purchasing power, even though he might not have any need for a particular product or a service. The third important personal factor influencing consumer behavior is the lifestyle. Now, lifestyles include people with similar values, interests, opinions, etc. An example for how lifestyle would influence consumer behavior is given. Take the case of a person giving importance to a healthy lifestyle. Such a kind of a person would prefer organic foods, which are much more healthier, and thus he would resort to buying them from special stores where they have access to organic food. And at the same time, he would also be an active person who's regularly involved in exercising, like taking regular jogs. So he'll prefer to spend his money on buying shoes and other jogging accessories. So his interest or his lifestyle or his choice of a healthy lifestyle leads him to making certain kinds of choices. Another example would be the life of a frequent traveler. A frequent traveler lifestyle requires or has different needs, and hence his priorities will also be different. So values, interests, opinions, and lifestyle, they also influence the consumer. The last personal factor that influences consumer behavior is a person's personality and self-concept. A personality, nothing but traits and characteristics specific to an individual. Now, these traits and characteristics specific to an individual, called personality traits, they are the product of interaction between psychological and physiological characteristics of the individual. And this interaction will result in a constant set of behaviors which is specific to a particular individual. Now, some of the common personality traits include sociability, the level of confidence, the level of autonomy, curiosity, etc. Similarly, self-concept, which is nothing but the image a person has or would like to have about himself. Now, personality and self-concept together influences a customer's choice for a particular product. Customers tend to favor products that match or convey the same self-concept or the same kind of personality. An example would be the case of Apple products, where Apple markets their product with an image of innovation, creativity, boldness, and singularity. People who feel that these products match them or match their personality or self-concept, they generally tend to buy it. Another simple example would be the case of an advertisement used by an old passenger car called the Mahindra Burrito. The tagline of the product was "Be a Burrito Man." This particular product emphasized the manly characteristics of the product, and people who would sympathize or who could empathize with that particular trait of being manly would prefer that specific product. So with that we conclude the various personal factors influencing consumer behavior. The last set of factors influencing consumer behavior are psychological characteristics or psychological factors. The next set of factors influencing consumer behavior are referred to as psychological factors. Now, the first psychological factor that influences consumer behavior is the level of motivation. Motivation is the expression of a need which has become so compelling enough to lead a consumer to satisfy it. Motivation is what drives consumers to make a purchase. So the marketing team should try and create and reinforce a need in the consumer's mind so that it makes or it results in the purchase. An example for this would be the case where a company showcases a new version of a product which was launched 6 months prior. An example, take the case of a mobile phone. A mobile phone which was launched 6 months ago, there is a refreshed and updated model which has been launched currently. So the marketing team tries to highlight how this product is different from its previous iteration, and this message is conveyed so as to try and create and reinforce a need in the consumers so that they replace their previous mobile phones, the previous version of their mobile phone, with a newer one. Now, this is how motivation influences consumer behavior. The second psychological factor is perception. Now, perception is a process by which an individual selects, organizes, and interprets information in order to do something that makes sense. So, perception is what decides if a person would react to a situation, and if he does, how will he react in a given situation. So perception decides if and how a person acts in a given situation. Now this is purely based upon the process used by an individual to select, organize, and interpret information, and he uses these interpretations to do something that makes sense to him. So perception depends upon personal characteristics, certain experiences and beliefs that the person have. And there are three perception mechanisms which are important. They are selective attention, selective distortion, and selective retention. Now, in selective attention, an individual focuses upon a few details or stimuli to which a person is subjected. He gives attention to only things that he likes to value. The rest of the details are left out in such a kind of perception mechanism. So selective attention is a mechanism where an individual focuses only on a few details or stimuli which he would like to receive. The second kind of mechanism is called as selective distortion, where we have different interpretations of the same information or stimuli by different people. Now, this difference in interpretation may be due to their differences in beliefs and values. People will try to interpret an information and make it consistent with their beliefs and values. So this might result in different kinds of interpretations for the same information or stimuli. An example for selective distortion is the case of a product being introduced at a low price. Some people may consider this to be a positive aspect, while others think of it as a product being cheap. So the same information or stimuli, which is a reduction in price or a low price situation, is being interpreted in two different fashions by two different sets of people. These interpretations are consistent with their beliefs, values, and needs. So people who consider low price as positive might be people who value low price. So people belonging to the lower class lower class of society who are limited by their purchasing power would feel that low price is a positive, while people belonging to the higher classes of the society, they feel that the low price is an indication of the product being cheap quality. Now the third kind of perception mechanism is where it's called as selective retention, and here people do not retain all the information that they are exposed to, but will only retain. So here people listen to all the information that is given, but they do not remember or retain every information. They only retain some parts of the information transferred. An example is consumers will remember the benefit of a product that they like and forget its drawbacks. So in selective retention, people favoring a particular kind of products, they are likely to remember only the positives, and they forget and completely avoid discussing its drawbacks, even though the product is not perfect and has its drawbacks. So in selective retention perception mechanism, people do not retain all the information that they have been exposed to, but will only retain some things. Now, the next important factor or psychological factor influencing consumer behavior is learning. Now, there is a change in behavior through or from experience or learning. Example is a case where good experiences in owning a product will result in a desire being created in the consumer to buy the same product or products from the same brand which have given them good experiences. So the consumer behavior can be altered from learning and from experiences. Good experiences will positively reinforce the buying behavior, whereas bad or poor experiences will make a person shy away from making a purchase from which he has had a bad experience. So marketing can use learning as a good learning to build good image by associating it with a positive reinforcement. An example for this would be the case where a person using a particular brand of car has had a good ownership experience. So the next time he decides to replace the car with a newer one, he is more likely to purchase a car from the same brand which has given him more satisfaction and good experiences in owning their product. The last psychological factor that influences consumer behavior is beliefs and attitude. Now, a belief is a conviction an individual has on something, and these beliefs are developed from experiences, learning, and external influences. Similarly, attitude, the feeling or assessment of an object or an idea, and the predisposition to act in a certain way towards that particular object. So, an example would be the case where a person, through his experiences of using a particular brand of a product, has had bad and poor experiences. He believes that he develops a belief that a particular product or a brand is poor, and he develops an attitude and feeling for products manufactured by the same brand, and he has a predetermined way of acting towards a particular object. For example, a person buying a product from company X, he used the product over a time and he has had a horrible time using that particular product, both in terms of how far it has met his requirements and how far he has been troubled to get it maintained. So if his experiences in using a product or a service has been poor, then he would naturally develop a very negative belief and a very negative attitude towards a particular product, whereby he would have a predetermined response towards buying a product from the same brand. He would not recommend and he would not buy a product manufactured by the same brand that has given him poor experiences. So this is how beliefs and attitudes can influence consumer behavior, and these beliefs and attitudes are developed from experiences, learning, and certain external influences. So the marketing team should concentrate upon changing the negative beliefs and attitudes of consumers and converting them into positive beliefs and positive attitudes. And this can be done only by providing consumers with products that lead them to have that lead or that give them positive experiences. So with this we conclude the various factors influencing consumer behavior. The various factors can be summarized as cultural factors, social factors, personal factors, and psychological factors. With this, we conclude lecture number 1. Thank you.